By the end of this video, you will know about the tense system used by verbs in the Greek New Testament. Hi, McIver here. Let's talk about tenses in a way that makes it easier for beginners to understand, but yet covers them in sufficient depth. I imagine this is a video you're going to want to come back to several times. So to help you find what you're looking for, I've put a timestamp next to the various topics. In the video, we're going to begin with what's probably most familiar to you, the English tense system, and we're going to compare that to the Greek tense system. And then we're going to do a little bit of a deepish dive and look at the Greek tense system on its own merits. And after the deepish dive, we're going to step back and say, oh, wait a minute, how do we make this easier to understand? Well, that's the plan. Let's begin by thinking about the tenses in the English language. Now, if you've been speaking English all your life, you probably haven't realized that you know all these tenses. But there they are, and you'll recognize them. English, it turns out, has 3 tenses. Well, there's some argument as to whether there's 2 or 3, but I'm sticking to 3. And the 3 tenses are present tense, past tense, and future tense. And each tense has 4 aspects. They have a simple aspect, continuous aspect, a perfect aspect, and a perfect continuous aspect. Well, what does that mean? Let's give examples of the present tense in its 4 aspects. And the example I've chosen, as you might expect, is the word I loose. That is because luo is the word we use for the paradigm of the regular verb in Greek. So in English, the simple present is I loose. The continuous present is I am loosing. The perfect present is I have loosed. And the perfect continuous is I have been loosing. Now, what does that mean in the past tense and the future tense? Let's look at what happens to luo as we move from the present tense to the past tense. So the simple present is I loose. Today, I loose. The simple past is yesterday, I loosed. The simple future, tomorrow, I will loose. And we can do something similar for the 4 aspects. For example, present, I am loosing. Yesterday, I was loosing. Tomorrow, I will be loosing. That's the continuous aspect. Perfect aspect. Today, I have loosed. Yesterday, I had loosed. Tomorrow, I will have loosed. And perfect continuous aspect. Today, I have been loosing. Yesterday, I had been loosing. And tomorrow, I will have been loosing. English, of course, has an active voice and a passive voice. So here are the English tenses for the passive voice. There are 12 for the active voice and 12 for the passive voice, making a total of 24. I won't talk about this much because, well, this video is directed at beginners, isn't it? And normally the passive voice occurs later in your Greek course. I include it here though because, as I say, I expect some of you will come back from time to look at this video, and it's nice to have it complete. So when you want to, you can pause the video and look more carefully at what happens in the English passive voice. Now we come to the 5 tenses found in the Greek New Testament. They are the present tense, the aorist tense, the imperfect tense, the future tense, the perfect tense, and the pluperfect tense. And as you can see in the graph, the present and aorist tenses are used much more frequently than the other tenses. And once we move away from the indicative mood, this is even more marked. There are a few participles and subjunctives found in the perfect tense, but most of them will be either a present tense or an aorist tense. Now, how do these tenses compare to the English tenses? What I've done here is to list the English tenses one after another, starting with the present and their 4 aspects, and the past and its 4 aspects, and 2 of the 4 aspects in the future. And I've put the closest equivalent Greek tense next to it. I've done it also for the passive voice, And if you were learning Greek to translate from English into Greek, you would need to know this. But for most of us, we are translating from the Greek New Testament. What I've shown here are the 5 tenses in Greek down the left-hand side, the present, aorist, imperfect, future perfect, and pluperfect. The form of luo, I loose, aorist, elusa, I loosed, and I've got the translation in the final column. And in the third column, I have put the closest equivalent English tense. Let me just go through those, explain them a bit. So the present tense of luo can be translated by 3 different tenses, if you like. I put tenses in kind of inverted commas there, and you'll find out why in a second. The first 2 possibilities are indeed authentic tenses. So the Greek present tense can be translated with the English simple present as I lose. It can be translated as the English continuous present as I am loosing. Well, you didn't see the emphatic present on our list of tenses, did you? And, well, if you look around, you'll see that it's kind of a tense or maybe not, so we won't call it a tense. But every time we put the word not or no in a sentence, we're going to be adding the word do. Just take, for example, I not loose. Well, that doesn't make sense in English, does it? I not loose. You have to say, I do not loose. Where did that do come from? Well, that's what we use in English, and that's called an emphatic present. When we look at the aorist tense, the closest English tense would be the simple past, and you translate elusa as I loosed. When we come to the imperfect, there are 2 possible translations here. Again, one is from the tenses that we've been listing that occur in English. The continuous past, I was loosing. The inceptive past wasn't on that list either. It's just a way of saying you can also translate luon as I began loosing. The future tense luso corresponds most closely to the English simple future, I will loose. And the perfect tense leluka corresponds to the perfect present in English, I have loosed. And the pluperfect elulukain corresponds to the perfect past in English and is translated I had loosed. You'll remember I put up the passive forms already, so I put them up here again for completeness, and if you're interested, you can pause the video and study this slide a little more carefully. But for most of us, we're meeting tenses for the first time, so let's concentrate on the English active voice and the Greek active voice. So here is our first step in understanding the tense system in New Testament Greek. Well, it's a first step. We've got a few steps to go yet. When you're learning something new, you begin with what's familiar and you move to what's less familiar. So this is what is kind of familiar to you. And you'll be studying Greek probably for 2 purposes. One, to pass exams, and this will be very helpful for you in that quest to pass exams. But you also want to understand the New Testament better in a way that you can only get from the Greek New Testament. So to do that, we need to dive a little deeper into the tense system in New Testament Greek. Now, like most things in the New Testament, the tense system in New Testament Greek has been studied very intensively, and there's a general agreement that 3 things are important to consider when seeing how the tenses work in the Greek New Testament. The most important, probably, is aspect, then the type of action. Well, to use the word the Germans used to describe this when they first started talking about it, Aktionsart. And finally, I'll share with you a little debate about how important time is in the Greek tense system. Let's begin with aspect. And I'm going to use an illustration that Stanley Porter uses, and he tells us that he got the illustration from Alexander Osachenko, a Russian linguist. And if you read his footnote, you'll be very impressed by how complex that book sounds that he got this from. In any event, If you've spent any time in Disneyland or in a town or city in America, you will have become familiar with their love of street parades. And Porter says, well, there's 3 different ways to view a street parade, at least. So let's say you got there early, you choose the prime spot on the corner, and the parade comes there and goes past, and you're observing the parade. You are looking at the parade as an ongoing activity, as almost a participant. Another observer may be flying a helicopter. Let's say it's the news service. And from the helicopter, you can view the whole parade at once as a whole, from beginning to end, and all of the bits in between. And finally, at the end of the day, as some city administrator is looking at, well, what it costs to put out all the barricades and collect all the rubbish, etc., you are looking at the results of the activity of the parade. Well, let's translate that into the terms used to describe aspect. 3 aspects have been identified in New Testament Greek. There is the imperfective, the perfective, and the stative aspect. Now, I have to say, don't get confused between the imperfective aspect and the imperfect tense, or the perfective aspect and the perfect tense. It's kind of unfortunate that they sound so similar, but the terms imperfective, perfective, and stative are the terms usually used for these 3 aspects. So we're kind of stuck with paying attention, aren't we? So the imperfective aspect is the viewpoint at street level. So if we are observing the parade from the street, we're part of the ongoing action, and that is the imperfective aspect. And in Greek, the present tense and the imperfect tense are commonly used with an imperfective aspect. The view from the helicopter, which sees the whole parade at once, corresponds to the perfective aspect. The activity is viewed as a whole, and the aorist tense is the tense that most often has this aspect. And at the end of the day, when we're looking at the results of what had happened earlier, we're looking at a stative aspect. And the 2 Greek tenses used mostly for the stative aspect are the perfect and the pluperfect. A second thing that an author is probably unconsciously thinking about or choosing on the basis of is the type of action implicit in the verb and in the tense. There are several different kinds of actions that can be meant or implied. There is a continuous action, an iterative action, and a punctiliar action. I'm almost embarrassed to do it on video, but as I do it in my class, I'll have to do it here. So continuous is punctiliar accent is, and iterative, well, somewhere in between. An inceptive or an ingressive action is the beginning of an action. Conative is attempting an action. Desiderative is desires an outcome. Gnomic, well, that's talking about a proverb or a generalized saying. And perfect, well, an action in the past that has relevance in the present. And you can see there that an ingressive actionsart would be expressed with either the imperfect or an aorist tense, a conative by a present or an imperfect. An expression that desires an action or an outcome would be expressed with an imperfect tense. Gnomics are found in both present and aorist tenses, and the perfect tense represents perfect actionsart. A third consideration is that of time. Now, here I must confess, there is a difference between English and Greek tenses in the attention given to time. And certainly time is probably slightly more important in the choice of an English tense than it might be in a Greek tense, where aspect might be a more important consideration. In fact, some scholars, like Stanley Porter, go so far as to say the Greek tenses don't convey time. I find myself not quite there. I will say they don't emphasize time as much, but time is a consideration, especially in the indicative and the participial moods. All right, so for the indicative mood, we have the present tense, which describes action contemporaneous to the person writing or the viewer. An aorist tense for past events, an imperfect tense for past events, a future tense, well, that is for future events, and a perfect and pluperfect are used of past events where a state has changed, which it remains into the present if it's a perfect, or remains into the past if it's a pluperfect. The rules for time considerations with the participial mood are a little more complex, but I've included them here just for the sake of completeness. And once you've studied participles, you will have heard about how the action of the participle relates to the action of the verb in the indicative, or the main verb. Here is the remarkable point, though. When we come to the other moods, such as the infinitive, the subjunctive, the imperative, and the optative, the difference between a present tense and an aorist tense isn't about time at all. That much is clear. The difference is mostly about aspect. A present tense has an imperfective aspect. It is used of a viewpoint that is embodied in the action, and the action is ongoing. An aorist tense is used with perfective aspect. It views the action as a whole. Well, that was a bit of a deep dive, wasn't it? Oh, yeah. So is there anything that we can use to make this make more sense to the English speaker? Well, I've listed some of them here. First of all, I think it's helpful to actually memorize the mapping of the Greek tenses into their closest English tense. That will help you with being able to translate for exams and tests. But most importantly, it will give you a starting point. And from that starting point, once you've had some practice, you'll be able to say, yes, well, I need to expand my understanding of tense. I need to perhaps listen to this video again and think again about aspect and actionsart, maybe even time considerations. So, memorizing, yes, memorizing paradigms. So you instantly recognize what tense a particular verb is in and also what mood it's in. Practice. Well, no avoiding it, is there? With languages, it's a mixture of memorization and practice. And if you're looking for some exercises which give you good steady practice in the various tenses and sometimes talks about aspect, you might be interested to look at some of the exercises in my book, Beginning New Testament Greek Made Easier. And indeed, this video is based on information found in the early part of chapter 14 of that book. Now, once you've had practice, it's probably a good time to come back to the video and think about aspect and actionsart and what it might mean in the sentences you've been translating. And so you begin with saying, well, this is the closest equivalent in English. But then you get to the stage where you think, well, no, Greek is not English with just different words. It's actually its own language. And I need to understand the tense system a little more. And I need to have a good go at understanding what aspect is and what actionsart is and how it affects the meaning of this particular passage I might be translating. And finally, if you'd like to know more about tense, you will be interested to look at chapter 3 of my book, Intermediate New Testament Greek Made Easier. All right, so coming back to sum up, how do we make it easier to understand the tense system in the Greek New Testament? Well, I suggest you start here, looking at the tenses in Greek and then seeing what their closest English equivalent is. And also memorizing LU, O, LU-SAR, LU-ON, etc., the forms of the various tenses. Once you've started there, you can begin to build your understanding of the tense system in New Testament Greek. This video is part of a series of videos on the grammar and syntax of New Testament Greek. As you can see, there are a cluster of these videos around the topic of the aorist tense, which you might find interesting. You can most easily find these videos by subscribing to my YouTube channel, NT Greek Made Easier, or by following me on x.com at robmciver2024. And hey, if you found this video helpful, why not let me know by clicking on the like button below or by clicking on the heart icon. Thank you.